Welcome back, everybody. My name is Sucker, and today's video is all about the worst starter on every single NBA team. Now, today, I'm covering the Western Conference, and I did the Eastern Conference in a previous video, so if you missed that, be sure to check that out. I will leave that link down in the comment section below. As I said in the beginning of that video, do your best to not get too upset about who I pick for each of these teams. There has to be a worst starter on every single team. That's just the way it is. If you disagree, feel free to let me know who you think it should be in the comment section below. The other thing I'll mention that I said in the other video was that I'm kind of stretching the definition of who a starter is for each of these teams, simply because the game started stat is not consistent across every single team. Some teams have had more injuries than others. Some players have had to step up and be a starter on teams that they wouldn't otherwise, so just keep that in mind as we go throughout this video. But division by division, we're going to start off with the Denver Nuggets, and unfortunately, it's going to be Gary Harris. And I say unfortunately because this is a player that 2 years ago looked like he was really starting to break out, and last year he had some injury issues, didn't play very well, and that has continued into this season. And I do think that Gary Harris is a talented player, someone that can defend pretty well, someone that can make shots, doesn't have great size but has good length, can play make, can shoot, is a pretty versatile player, but for whatever reason, the offense just hasn't translated for the last season plus the 20 games of this year. And it's unfortunate because this is a Denver team that needs what he can provide. They need the shot making, they need the defense. And for the last, like I said, year plus 20 games, it just hasn't been there for him. So unfortunately, on a team that is so talented, Gary Harris is the Nuggets' worst starter. Moving on now to the Utah Jazz, and it's going to be Royce O'Neal. He's a good defender, but this is a team that has a really talented starting lineup, and unfortunately, like I said, there has to be a worst starter, and it's going to be him. I will say, however, though, if you're taking out Royce O'Neal, it's kind of Mike Conley. Again, just statistically, I've made a video about him in the past, talking about how that's kind of their big issue right now, is how poorly he's playing, the possibility that it could be related to an injury that he's trying to recover from, and people gave me a lot of hate saying, no, he's starting to play better, he's going to be fine, and things still haven't turned around for them. So I will briefly mention him, but obviously it's still going to be O'Neal. Conley's not the worst starter on the Jazz, but he's probably second worst right now. Moving on now to the Minnesota Timberwolves, and it's a player that I'm very familiar with as a Nets fan, and that's Treveon Graham. He started occasionally for the Nets last year, and the shooting percentages on this guy are disgusting. And he started a good amount of games for this team, and a team that's been more successful than a lot of people thought they would be. He's a solid defender, someone that supposedly is supposed to be able to make shots off the ball. That hasn't happened so far this season, and this one is probably the most clear worst starter across the entire NBA, with the exception of Cam Reddish for the Atlanta Hawks, which I talked about in the last video. Even to the point where when I tweeted about talking about doing this video, like the first reply was, you have to mention Treveon Graham on the Timberwolves. So he is the worst starter for Minnesota. Next up now is another really obvious one for the Thunder, and it's Terrence Ferguson. And again, shooting percentage wise, this guy's just not making shots off the ball. And the way the NBA is right now, if you're not a superstar and you're not a big that's protecting the rim and rolling to the rim, you have to be able to make shots off the ball. You can be a really good defender like Frank Ntilikina, but if you're not making shots off the ball, you're not nearly as valuable as a lot of other players around the league, and that's where Terrence Ferguson is. He's not a great defender, and he's not someone that's making shots off the ball, and it's just kind of out of necessity right now, and really last year as well, that he's starting and getting so many minutes for this team. So again, pretty obvious one for the Thunder, it's Terrence Ferguson. And the next up is going to be the Portland Trail Blazers, and I'm kind of stretching the definition of this one a little bit because they've had so many guys fill in for injuries and things like that, but it's going to be Anthony Tolliver, even though he doesn't really start that much for them anymore. He was earlier in the season, and just out of all the other guys that have started a significant amount of games, he is playing the worst. He's someone that for the last couple of years has been a relatively reliable off-ball shooter from three-point range in the front court, and he hasn't been that so far for Portland, at least so far with the shooting percentages, so he is going to be the Trailblazers' worst starter. Moving on now to the LA Lakers, and unfortunately, it's going to be Avery Bradley. And I say unfortunately because this is a player that I had hopes for potentially turning around his career with the Lakers this year, was a really good player with Boston with those Isaiah Thomas teams, then moved around, had some injury issues, was really bad last year in the minutes that he got, and now with the Lakers has been a little bit better, but again, it's just not making shots off the ball. He's still a good defender, but he doesn't bring great size to the backcourt, and again, shooting off the ball has been an issue. Also, in general, a lot of the Lakers starters have been really good. Even JaVale McGee, who technically starts but only plays like 17, 18 minutes. Danny Green is making shots. KCP is actually making a good amount of shots lately, which isn't surprising for a Lakers team that has the best record in the league. But still, they have to have a worse starter, and it's going to be Avery Bradley. Moving on now to the other LA team with the Clippers, and it's going to be Patrick Patterson. And again, this is a player that has been bad over the last couple of seasons, like Avery Bradley, and hasn't been able to turn it around in a significant way with the Clippers. His role for the last 10 years has been stand off the ball, make some jump shots, and earlier in his career, he was actually a pretty good front court defender and rebounder. Now he's pretty much just a shooting specialist that can't make shots. And this was a pretty tough one to find, like a starter that actually hasn't been playing well for them. But once I found Patterson's name, it became pretty clear that he's the worst starter for the Clippers. Next up now is the surprisingly competent Phoenix Suns. And I say that because you look at their starting unit and there's actually not really that obvious of a player to pick here. I'm going to go with Dario Saric just because the efficiency is down, and really over his last 18 months of basketball in the NBA, all of his stats are pretty much down from his time in Philadelphia. I still think he's a promising player. He's a free agent this offseason. But again, for a Suns team that has a really good starting unit, it's really been the bench that's been an issue. Saric has been the player that, in my opinion, is their worst starter. Next up now is the Sacramento Kings, and I'm going to go with Nemanja Bjelica. I always mispronounce his name. You guys know who I'm talking about. And again, this is a team that surprisingly actually has a really good starting unit, and it's almost by default that he's here. I almost went with Corey Joseph for this, but he didn't really start enough games for me to really count him, just because of some injury issues. He kind of filled in with De'Aaron Fox missing games and everything, but he hasn't started as many games as Bjelica and just doesn't really necessarily qualify as a starter in my mind, so that's why I'm going with him. Speaking of injuries, next up is the Golden State Warriors. And they're all over the place when you look at their roster. They've got so many different guys that have started a significant amount of games, but I'm going to go with Jordan Poole. And when you look at his statistics, it's pretty obvious why I'm picking him. Efficiency-wise from the field as a scorer, it's been absolutely dreadful, and he's not really a starter for them anymore. They've been trying a whole bunch of different lineups, but he started enough games for me to consider him a starter to this point in the season, and so unfortunately he is the Warriors' worst starter. Moving on now to the last division, and it's going to start with the Houston Rockets, and this was by far the most difficult selection for me to pick, because when you think about the Rockets, they've got James Harden, they've got Russell Westbrook, they've got Clint Capella. The other two guys that have been starting games for them for the most part are PJ Tucker and Daniel House. So it's between one of those two guys, but from a statistical standpoint, they're both having good seasons. We know how good of a defender PJ Tucker is, and then Daniel House is a really nice young player. So I'm going to go with Daniel House because he's less experienced, because we know what PJ Tucker does as a defender and as an energy guy for this team. But you really could pick either one of these guys, and you'd be wrong both times, because this is, when healthy, one of the better starting units in the league, especially statistically. So I'm going to say House for the Rockets, but I don't really feel that strongly about it. Moving on now to the Dallas Mavericks, and this is another one that was a bit of a difficult choice, but for me, I'm going to go with Dorian Finney-Smith, and he's a player that for most of his career has been good defender, good wing player, good size, can't make shots off the ball, and that trend has continued to this point, at least not at an above league average rate. And if he could do that, he would be an extremely valuable player for the Mavericks or for any team around the league. To this point, he's still valuable. He brings value to this team, but when you're looking at worst starters, he's the one that struggles the most to make shots off the ball, so I'm going to go with him. Moving on now to the very disappointing San Antonio Spurs, and statistically, I'm going to go with Trey Lyles, and also just because I don't think he's as talented as the other player that I'm going to talk about here. But I was really close to putting DeJounte Murray, and I understand that he's coming back from an injury, and he hasn't had a ton of experience in the NBA, and he's still extremely young, but from a statistical standpoint, it does not look good right now, and I understand you have to watch the games. He's a very good defender. I get that, but I was weirdly close to putting him here, but I'm going to go with Trey Lyles for the Spurs' worst starter. Second to last now is the Memphis Grizzlies, and this is another one that was pretty tough, and I kind of just came to this player by default, and that is Jay Crowder, because a lot of the other starters from Memphis are playing well, and it's just about Crowder's statistics being a little bit down. He's obviously still a pretty good defender, someone that brings energy, can make shots off the ball, is a pretty good role player, but for the Grizzlies, they've got a pretty talented starting unit, so Crowder kind of has to be the worst one. And then last up, for the New Orleans Pelicans, it's going to be Kenrich Williams, and whenever I watch them play, I'm always like, oh, I want to see Brandon Ingram, I want to see Drew Holiday, Jackson Hayes is a pretty exciting player to watch. And then I see this guy in the starting lineup, and I'm like, what? Who is this? And he's not awful, right? Like, he's a pretty solid role player, has some size, can make some shots, but they actually have a pretty good starting unit. in New Orleans. And so again, just kind of by default, that's who I'm going to go with for the Pelicans' worst starter. And there you have it. That is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.